All right, fourth graders, we are in Unit 4, Week 5, and our story this week is Encyclopedia Brown. So you can get your word collectors out and be ready to learn some new words this week. Before we get started, just to review our word work expectations. So remember to have your headphones in and your volume up on your iPad. Remember to pause and rewind the video whenever you need to, but remember not to fast forward in the video. Remember to write your own sentences in your vocab foursquare. So I'll give you an example of a sentence, and then based on that definition, you need to create your own sentence for that word. And then, as always, work hard and be an active learner. All right, our first word this week is reference. A sentence using the word reference is, these encyclopedias are reference books. So if you take a look at this picture, it looks like a picture from a library, and all of those books there are encyclopedias, and so those would be considered reference books. So before I give you that definition, I want you to think about what that word means, and then write that down in your word collector. So reference means used for information or help. Used for information or help. So an encyclopedia would be a great example of something that's used for information. So I want you to think about what reference could you use to help you find synonyms for a word. So each week we find synonyms for our vocab words. So what reference do you use? So hopefully you're thinking about using the thesaurus. So we use an online thesaurus, but you can also find books that are a thesaurus. So that would be a reference that's used for information or help. So other things would be dictionaries, encyclopedias, a thesaurus. There's lots of different examples of references. Our next word is lizards. Lizards like this one live in warm, dry places. So you can look at the picture and use those clues from the sentence to think about what would be the definition of a lizard. So lizards are reptiles with long bodies and tails, movable eyelids, and 4 legs. So long bodies, tails, movable eyelids, and 4 legs, and they are considered reptiles. So I want you to think about, how would you describe a lizard? So if someone asked you what a lizard was, how would you go about describing that to that person? And maybe some of you have seen a lizard in person before, so that's a good connection to have. Right, our next word is crime. Police tape is often used to mark off the scene of a crime. So think about what the word crime means and write that down in your word collector before I give you that definition. So a crime is a violation of law or an activity of criminals. So crime is a violation of law or an activity of criminals. So I want you to think about, why is police tape, like the picture that we just looked at, used at the scene of a crime? So why do police officers put up that tape? Usually when there's a crime that is committed, police officers and detectives, they need to collect the evidence and things like that, so they can't have people walking through the scene of the crime. So that's why you'll see that police tape that's up, because they need to collect that evidence and keep people away from the scene. Our next word is exhibit. This museum exhibit includes fine art paintings. So if you look at this picture, it looks like it's in a museum. And this exhibit has different paintings by a lot of different artists. You can see they're very fancy or very fine art paintings. So an exhibit is a display or public showing. A display or public showing. So I've included some pictures of a few different kinds of exhibits. So this one right here is a bike exhibit. So if you look at the picture, it must be in like a museum for bikes. And there's a lot of different examples. There's a bunch of different wheels and tires and things like that. Right here, this is a brain science exhibit. So this is also probably found in a museum. So there's a lot of digital learning things that are in there and some different models. And this last one right here, this is a dinosaur exhibit. So there's obviously a display and a model of some dinosaur bones. So if you've been to a museum before, you have most definitely been in some kind of exhibit. So if you've been to the Science Museum or the Children's Museum, you have been in an exhibit before. Our next word is reptiles. A sentence using the word reptiles is, turtles are reptiles. So if you look at this picture, maybe you've seen a turtle before in real life. They would be considered reptiles. So think about what features does a reptile have, or how would you define the word reptiles? So reptiles are cold-blooded animals with backbones and lungs, usually covered in scales. So cold-blooded animals with backbones and lungs, usually covered in scales. So maybe you can think about some examples of other animals that are reptiles. Okay, they're usually covered in scales, so think about animals that are covered in scales. Our next word is amphibians. Frogs are amphibians. So if you look at this picture of frogs, I'm sure all of us have seen or probably touched or held a frog before. Think about the characteristics or the features of a frog and how that makes them amphibians. So amphibians are cold-blooded animals with a backbone and moist, scaleless skin, with gills when young and lungs when they are grown. So amphibians, when they are small or when they're young, they have gills. And then as they grow up and mature, they produce lungs when they're all grown up. So they're cold-blooded. They have moist, which means like wet, scaleless skin. So if you think about a frog, usually their skin is very wet or moist or slimy, and amphibians do not have scales like reptiles. So compare and contrast. Think about, how are amphibians and reptiles similar? How are they different? So amphibians are going to have that slimy, moist, wet skin, and reptiles are going to have that bumpy, scaly, dry skin. Amphibians have gills when they're young that eventually turn into lungs. Your next word is salamanders. Some salamanders are very colorful. So just looking at this picture of a salamander, now that we've learned a little bit about reptiles and amphibians and found out what that means, look at this picture and think about, is a salamander a reptile or would it be an amphibian? So salamanders are shaped like lizards, but related to frogs and toads. So salamanders look a lot like lizards, but they're actually related to frogs and toads. So think about, does that make a salamander a reptile or an amphibian? So if we look at the skin of a salamander, it looks really moist, wet, slimy kind of. It doesn't have scales on it. So a salamander is actually considered an amphibian, just like frogs and just like toads. And our last word this week is stumped. This boy is stumped on a question on his history homework. So look at this question. Kind of look at the facial expression of this boy. And think about how he's feeling if he is feeling stumped. What does that mean? So stumped means to be puzzled or confused. So if you look at this picture of this baby, he's saying, huh? Which means he looks very confused or puzzled or stumped. So I want you to think about, when is a time when you've been stumped by something? Maybe it was like that boy in the picture that we just looked at. Maybe some homework sometimes has stumped you. Maybe someone has told you a riddle before, or a joke that has stumped you. You might have been confused by it. And this, kiddos, is our last word for this week. So remember, if you need to, go back and rewind, pause where you need to, record those definitions, and start working on the other squares of your vocabulary for square. Thanks for listening and being active learners.